Denver shows up on every relocation list published in the last 3 years. Not occasionally, consistently, reliably, as if the people writing those lists have a standing agreement to keep recommending it, regardless of what the numbers say. The problem is that the numbers changed. They changed dramatically, and they changed in ways that matter enormously to anyone making a serious decision about where to build their financial life. And yet the recommendations kept coming, cheerful and unrevised, like a restaurant review written in 2020 that nobody thought to update after the kitchen changed. Here is what actually happened. Between 2020 and 2022, Denver absorbed a migration wave that reshaped the city's cost structure permanently. Remote workers arrived with San Francisco salaries and San Francisco spending tolerance. Landlords noticed. Sellers noticed. The median home price in Denver crossed $500,000 and kept climbing. And the city that had marketed itself as an affordable alternative to coastal markets quietly became one of the most expensive non-coastal markets in the country, with the tax burden and the savings rate suppression that comes with that territory. The people who moved there early locked in favorable terms. The people who arrived during the peak paid full price for a city that was already transforming into something else entirely. By 2026, the market has shifted again, but not in the direction most people assume. Rents have come down from their peak. A 2-bedroom apartment that hit $2,450 a month in 2022 now rents at a median of $2,100. That sounds like relief. But the full financial model, housing cost, state and local tax burden, savings rate, time to home ownership, tells a story that is considerably more complicated than a single rent drop. This analysis exists because the surface-level version of this conversation has been doing real damage. Not dramatic damage, not the kind you notice immediately, but the quiet, compounding damage of decisions made with incomplete information. Someone earning $130,000 a year who moves to Denver in 2026 and rents a 2-bedroom is saving roughly 19% of their income after taxes and housing costs. The same person, same salary, same financial discipline, living in Raleigh, is saving 31%. That is a 12 percentage point gap. And on $130,000 a year, that gap compounds into a fundamentally different life trajectory over 5 years. The honest framing of Denver in 2026 is this: it is a good city for people who are already there with a pre-2020 cost basis. If you bought in 2019, if you locked in a rent in 2018, if your financial foundation in Denver predates the boom, you are in a structurally different position than someone arriving today. You are not evaluating Denver as a new entry point. You are evaluating whether to stay in a position that is already working. That is a very different question, and it deserves a very different answer, because conflating those two situations is exactly how bad decisions get made. For the person arriving today, the math only works under specific conditions. Not impossible ones, but specific ones. The right income level, the right housing type, the right neighborhood for investment purposes, the right time horizon before that break-even clock starts mattering. This is not an analysis that concludes Denver is broken and leaves you there with a vague warning. It is an analysis that defines, with precision, the exact profile of person for whom Denver makes financial sense in 2026, and equally, the profile of person for whom one of 4 comparable markets would produce a demonstrably better outcome at the same salary level. Raleigh, Charlotte, Salt Lake City, Boise. 4 markets worth examining in direct comparison, because comparison is the only intellectually honest way to evaluate a premium. Each of those cities is priced in a range close enough to Denver to make the side-by-side meaningful, and each of them, in at least one critical dimension, outperforms Denver for a specific type of buyer or renter arriving today. We will run those numbers in full, not selectively, not to make Denver look worse than it is, but because the data deserves to be seen all at once, rather than in the fragmented, cherry-picked form it usually takes online. What follows is a complete financial model, not a vibe check, not a lifestyle ranking, not a curated list of neighborhoods with good coffee. A model that calculates what Denver actually costs, what it actually returns, and what 8.2 years means when it is the number standing between you and the break-even point on buying versus renting. That number, 8.2 years, is the one that reframes the entire home ownership conversation in this market, and we will take it apart with the precision it deserves. By the time we are done, the decision in front of you will look a lot clearer than it does right now. Denver in 2026 is not a broken market. It is a market where the math has very specific conditions, and this is the analysis that finally defines them. Let's start with a person. Call him Jordan. He is 36 years old, earns $130,000 a year in a remote-enabled professional role, and he is genuinely considering Denver. He has heard the pitch, the mountains, the outdoors culture, the tech-adjacent job market, the sense that Denver is a serious city without the coastal price tag. He is smart enough to want the actual numbers before he commits, so let's give him the actual numbers, the full model, not the version that appears in relocation guides that were last updated when mortgage rates were 3%. Jordan's gross annual income of $130,000 produces a Colorado take-home of approximately $89,000 after federal and state income tax. Colorado's flat income tax rate sits at 4.4%, not the worst in the country, but not irrelevant either. Add Denver city taxes, and the effective combined burden on that $130,000 salary lands around 31% of gross income. That leaves Jordan with roughly $7,400 per month to work with before a single recurring expense appears on his bank statement. That number sounds workable. Then housing enters the equation. A two-bedroom apartment in a livable Denver neighborhood. Not luxury, not the cheapest option in the market, just a functional two-bedroom in a neighborhood with reasonable commute times and reasonable safety, runs $2,100 per month at the current median. That is the rent, not the total housing cost. Add renter's insurance at $30 a month, utilities averaging $190 per month in Denver's altitude-driven climate, and parking at $120 if Jordan does not luck into included parking. Total housing load, approximately $2,440 per month. That is 33% of his take-home income going directly to shelter before he has paid for food, transportation, health expenses, or anything that constitutes actually living in the city. Now build out the rest of the model. Transportation in Denver is not optional public transit territory the way New York or Chicago can be. A car is a practical reality for most residents, which means insurance, gas, and maintenance, averaging around $580 per month. Groceries and dining for a single professional in Denver run approximately $650 per month. Denver's food costs have tracked upward alongside its population growth, and the mountain town premium on everything from produce to restaurant checks is real. Health insurance, even with a solid employer contribution, typically runs $200 to $250 per month out of pocket. Add the incidental costs of actually being a person: clothing, personal care, subscriptions, and the occasional weekend in the mountains that is theoretically free but practically involves gear, gas, and food. And Jordan's monthly outflows land between $6,800 and $7,200 per month. That leaves Jordan saving somewhere between $200 and $600 per month, depending on how tightly he manages the variable costs. Annualized, that is a savings rate of approximately 19%, and that assumes discipline, no major unexpected expenses, and no lifestyle creep from living in a city that has an enormous number of ways to spend money on experiences. 19% sounds respectable in isolation. It stops sounding respectable the moment you compare it to what that same $130,000 salary produces in a comparable market. But we will get to that comparison shortly, because it deserves its own full treatment. The homeownership picture adds another layer of complexity. Denver's median home price in 2026 sits at approximately $560,000 for a single-family home in a desirable area. At current mortgage rates, which have stabilized in the upper 6% range, a 20% down payment on that median home produces a monthly mortgage payment of approximately $2,950 before property taxes and insurance. Property taxes in Denver run around 0.5% of assessed value annually, adding roughly $230 per month. Insurance in Colorado has climbed sharply due to wildfire risk and hail exposure, adding another $150 to $200. Total monthly housing cost as an owner, approximately $3,330, nearly $900 more per month than renting the equivalent two-bedroom. This gap between the cost of owning and the cost of renting is what produces that 8.2-year break-even figure. It means Jordan needs to stay in Denver for more than 8 years, holding the same property in a market that appreciates at historical average rates, before buying begins to outperform renting from a purely financial standpoint. 8.2 years is not forever, but it is a significant commitment to a specific city at a specific price point, made at a moment when 4 other comparable markets offer a structurally shorter break-even timeline and a higher savings rate along the way. The question is not whether Denver can work. For Jordan, under these exact conditions, it can, barely, narrowly, with limited margin for error. The question is whether it is the best version of the decision available to him. And that is a question the model answers directly, if you are willing to look at it honestly. There is a number buried in Denver's 2026 rental data that almost nobody is leading with, and it is genuinely interesting. The median two-bedroom apartment in Denver rents today for $2,100 per month. In 2022, that same two-bedroom was renting for $2,450. That is a $350 per month correction, a 14% drop from peak, in a market that was supposed to keep climbing indefinitely. For the first time in years, Denver is a tenant's market. And that shift, if you understand what is actually driving it, changes the calculus for a very specific type of person arriving in this city in 2026. Understanding why rents dropped requires understanding what caused them to spike in the first place. Between 2020 and 2022, Denver absorbed a population surge driven almost entirely by remote work migration. The city's rental vacancy rate fell to historic lows, below 4% at the peak, and landlords responded the way landlords always respond to scarcity. They raised prices aggressively and faced essentially zero resistance. Then 2 things happened simultaneously. Remote work policies began tightening at major employers, reducing the inflow of high-earning transplants. And a wave of multifamily construction that had been permitted during the boom years finally came online, adding thousands of new units to a market whose demand growth had already begun to soften. Supply caught up to demand. Then supply slightly exceeded demand, and rents adjusted accordingly. The current vacancy rate in Denver's rental market sits at approximately 7.2%, not dramatically high by historical standards, but meaningfully above the sub-4% environment of the boom years. That vacancy level is what creates negotiating power for tenants. Landlords who were fielding multiple applications per listing 2 years ago are now offering 1 month of free rent on 12-month leases, waiving application fees, and in some cases, dropping asking rents below their initial list price to close occupancy gaps before carrying costs accumulate. This is not a market in distress. It is a market that has rebalanced. And rebalancing, for a tenant with options, is an opportunity worth understanding precisely. The critical question is whether this correction is structural or cyclical. The honest answer is that it is almost certainly cyclical, with a timeline that matters enormously to how you use it. The construction pipeline that delivered Denver's new units is now largely exhausted. Permitting activity has fallen sharply, as higher interest rates have made new multifamily development economically marginal. That means the supply pressure currently holding rents down will begin to ease within the next 18 to 24 months, as new deliveries slow and population growth, which has not stopped, only moderated, continues to absorb available units. The tenant market window in Denver is real. It is also likely temporary, and the data points toward a demand-supply rebalancing that will put upward pressure on rents again by late 2027 or early 2028. What does this mean practically? If you are a renter arriving in Denver in 2026 with no intention of buying in the near term, you are entering this market at the best moment in 4 years for negotiating leverage. A well-timed lease signed in 2026, particularly in Q2 or Q3, when landlord desperation to fill units before the slower winter market peaks, can lock you into a rate that sits meaningfully below what the same unit will likely rent for 2 years from now. 12-month leases with renewal options, if you can negotiate them, become particularly valuable in this environment. The window is open. The question is how long it stays that way, and the construction data suggests the answer is not long enough to build a permanent strategy around, but long enough to use intentionally. There is a second dimension to this shift that gets almost no attention in the standard Denver coverage. The correction has not been uniform across the market. High-end luxury units, the glass towers with rooftop decks and co-working spaces that proliferated during the boom, have seen the sharpest rent declines because they were the most overbuilt segment, and they attract the most price-sensitive high-income renters who have the mobility to comparison shop aggressively. Mid-tier 2- and 3-bedroom units in established neighborhoods have corrected less dramatically. Entry-level 1-bedroom units in neighborhoods with strong walkability scores have barely corrected at all because demand at that price point has remained relatively stable throughout the cycle. The tenant market story is real, but it is concentrated in specific unit types and specific price points, and knowing which segment you are shopping in determines how much of the correction you actually get to capture. Here is the bottom line on the Denver rental market in 2026. If your plan is to rent for 2 to 3 years, save aggressively, and then reassess the home ownership decision with better information and a stronger down payment position, this is a reasonable moment to enter. The negotiating environment is favorable. The correction gives you a cost basis that would have been impossible in 2022, and the temporary of the shift actually works in your favor, because you are not betting on it being permanent, only on it being real enough to use right now. The tenant market window will close, but it has not closed yet. And for someone with a clear 2 to 3 year horizon and the discipline to use the savings rate differential productively, that window is worth walking through. The only way to evaluate a premium is to compare it to what you are giving up to pay it. Denver does not exist in isolation. It exists alongside a set of comparable markets that are priced in a similar range, offer similar quality of life characteristics, and compete directly for the same pool of mobile, high-earning professionals that Denver has been recruiting for the last decade. 4 of those markets deserve a direct side-by-side examination: Raleigh, Charlotte, Salt Lake City, and Boise. Same salary, $130,000, same financial discipline, same life stage, different outcomes. Let's look at what the model actually produces across all 5 cities. Raleigh first, because the gap is the most instructive. North Carolina has no city income tax on top of its state rate, and the state income tax sits at 4.5%, nearly identical to Colorado on paper. But the housing cost differential is where the comparison fractures. A comparable 2-bedroom apartment in Raleigh rents at approximately $1,550 per month, $550 less than Denver's median. That single line item, compounded across 12 months, produces $6,600 in additional annual savings before any other variable changes. Add the lower cost of transportation, dining, and the general cost of goods index in the Raleigh-Durham metro, and the same $130,000 salary produces a savings rate of 31% in Raleigh versus 19% in Denver. That is not a rounding error. That is 12 percentage points of your gross income, $15,600 per year, that Raleigh returns to you simply by not being Denver. Charlotte runs a nearly identical model to Raleigh. The 2 cities are separated by roughly 2 hours of driving and share a broadly similar cost structure. North Carolina's tax environment applies to both, and Charlotte's rental market sits at a median 2-bedroom price of approximately $1,600 per month. The savings rate on $130,000 in Charlotte lands at approximately 29%, 2 points below Raleigh, but still 10 points above Denver. Where Charlotte differentiates itself is in its financial services job market, which is one of the strongest outside New York, and in its home price trajectory, which has been appreciating at a pace that gives buyers a more favorable entry point relative to income than Denver currently offers. For someone whose career touches banking, fintech, or financial operations, Charlotte deserves serious consideration as a complete package, not just as a cost arbitrage play. Salt Lake City is the most nuanced comparison because it shares Denver's mountain-adjacent identity almost exactly. The outdoor culture, the altitude, the access to skiing and hiking. Salt Lake delivers the same lifestyle proposition at a meaningfully different price point. The median two-bedroom in Salt Lake currently rents at approximately $1,750 per month, roughly $350 below Denver. Utah's flat income tax rate sits at 4.55%, nearly identical to Colorado. The effective savings rate difference is smaller than the Denver-Raleigh gap. Salt Lake produces approximately 24 to 25% savings on $130,000. But the lifestyle equivalence makes the comparison particularly compelling. If what you are paying the Denver premium for is access to mountains and outdoor recreation, Salt Lake eliminates the rational basis for that premium almost entirely. You get the same mountains. You keep more of your salary. The only meaningful loss is Denver's name recognition, and name recognition does not compound in a brokerage account. Boise is the wild card in this comparison, and it earns its place at the table for a specific type of person. Idaho has a slightly higher effective income tax burden than Colorado. The marginal rate hits 5.8%, which narrows the take-home advantage. But Boise's housing market has corrected sharply from its own pandemic-era peak, and a two-bedroom apartment now rents at approximately $1,500 per month, among the lowest of the 5 cities in this analysis. The savings rate on $130,000 in Boise lands at approximately 27%, 8 points above Denver, and achieved in a city that has been aggressively building infrastructure, attracting tech employers, and positioning itself as a legitimate mid-tier metro rather than a flyover stopover. The risk with Boise is its relative market immaturity. The job market diversity is thinner than Denver, Raleigh, or Charlotte, and for someone whose career requires optionality, that concentration risk is real and worth pricing in. Here is what the full comparison tells you. Denver is not wildly out of line with its peer group on any single dimension. The tax burden is average, the rental correction has brought its costs closer to the field, and its job market remains among the strongest of the 5. What Denver loses consistently across every comparison is the savings rate contest. It sits at the bottom of this 5-city field on that metric, and savings rate is the number that determines how quickly you build the financial foundation that makes everything else possible. The down payment, the investment portfolio, the emergency fund that keeps a bad month from becoming a bad year. The Denver premium is real. The question this analysis is building toward is whether, for your specific situation, that premium buys something concrete enough to justify the cost. And the answer to that question depends almost entirely on a variable we have not fully examined yet, the break-even clock. 8.2 years. That is the number that sits at the center of every serious conversation about buying a home in Denver in 2026. It is the amount of time that needs to pass. Holding the same property in a market appreciating at historical average rates, at current mortgage rates, and current home prices, before the financial outcome of buying outperforms the financial outcome of renting the equivalent space and investing the difference. 8.2 years is not a number that makes buying irrational. It is a number that makes buying a very specific kind of commitment, and understanding exactly how that number is constructed is the only way to decide whether that commitment makes sense for you. The break-even calculation starts with the cost gap between owning and renting. As we established in the financial model, a median Denver home purchased today at $560,000 with a 20% down payment, $112,000 out of pocket, produces a monthly carrying cost of approximately $3,330 when you include mortgage principal and interest, property taxes, and insurance. The median equivalent rental for comparable space runs $2,100 per month. That is a monthly gap of $1,230, $14,760 per year, that the owner pays above and beyond what the renter pays for equivalent housing. That gap is the engine of the break-even clock. Every month it runs, the renter who invests that difference is building a competing financial position that the owner needs home appreciation to overcome. Now factor in the transaction costs of buying. Colorado closing costs on a $560,000 purchase run approximately 3 to 4% of the purchase price. Call it $17,000 in round numbers. Real estate agent commissions on the eventual sale, even in a post-settlement commission environment, add another 2 to 3% on the exit. That is a combined transaction cost load of roughly $45,000 to $55,000 spread across entry and exit, costs that the home's appreciation must first recover before the owner is actually ahead of the renter. These transaction costs alone account for more than 2 full years of the 8.2-year break-even timeline. They are not a footnote. They are a structural feature of the calculation that every buyer needs to internalize before signing. The mortgage rate environment amplifies the problem in a way that is historically unusual. Buyers who purchased Denver homes in 2019 and 2020 locked in 30-year fixed rates between 3 and 3.5%. Their monthly carrying costs on those same $560,000 homes, purchased at lower prices and financed at lower rates, look nothing like the carrying costs facing a buyer today. A buyer at 6.75% on today's prices is servicing a fundamentally different financial instrument than the person who bought 5 years ago, and the break-even timeline those earlier buyers experienced was dramatically shorter, closer to 4 to 5 years in a market that was also appreciating faster. The 8.2-year figure is a product of this specific moment, high prices combined with normalized rates. It is not permanent, but it is the reality of the entry point available today. Here is what the break-even number means, practically for different types of buyers. If you are confident you will stay in Denver for 10 or more years, the math on buying eventually works. You will cross the break-even point, and every year beyond it, the ownership position compounds in your favor as equity builds, and your fixed mortgage payment becomes a smaller percentage of a presumably higher income. If your horizon is 5 to 7 years, the range that covers most people who describe themselves as planning to settle down without a fully committed long-term plan, the math is genuinely unfavorable. You would likely exit the position before reaching break-even, absorb the transaction costs on both ends, and have been better off renting and investing the monthly gap the entire time. That is not speculation. That is what the model produces when you run the numbers honestly. The break-even timeline also varies by neighborhood in ways that matter enormously if you are seriously considering buying. Denver's inner suburbs, Lakewood, Arvada, Westminster, have lower entry prices relative to their rental equivalents than the city core, which compresses the monthly cost gap and shortens the break-even timeline to closer to 6 to 7 years in the most favorable cases. The Capitol Hill and Five Points areas of central Denver, where home prices carry a significant urban premium over their rental equivalents, push the break-even out toward 9 to 10 years. The zip code you buy in is not just a lifestyle decision. It is a financial variable that can move your break-even timeline by 2 to 3 years in either direction. And that difference determines whether a 7-year stay produces a net positive or a net negative outcome. The honest conclusion on Denver homeownership in 2026 is this: buying here is a viable financial decision for a specific type of buyer with a specific time horizon, a large enough down payment to manage the carrying cost gap, and a genuine long-term commitment to this market. It is not a decision that should be made under the assumption that Denver appreciation will bail out a short timeline or an undercapitalized entry. The 8.2-year number is not a warning to avoid Denver. It is a minimum commitment threshold, and knowing that threshold precisely is the difference between a purchase that builds wealth and one that quietly erodes it. Most of the Denver real estate investment conversation happening right now is noise. It is people looking at a market they have heard good things about, pulling up Zillow listings, running a back-of-napkin calculation on gross rent versus purchase price, and concluding that the numbers are too tight to work. They are right about the conclusion and wrong about the analysis. The numbers are too tight in most of the market. But most of the market is not where the investment case for Denver lives in 2026. The investment case is specific, it is geographically concentrated, and it is centered on a property type that most retail investors overlook because they are too focused on the single-family narrative that dominated the last decade. Start with what does not work, because eliminating bad options quickly is how you find the good ones. Single-family homes in Denver's desirable urban neighborhoods, Washington Park, Cherry Creek, Highlands, Sloan's Lake, are priced at levels that produce cap rates in the 2.5 to 3.5% range at current rents and current prices. That is not an investment. That is a storage vehicle for capital that happens to require a property manager and a new roof every 20 years. The price-to-rent ratios in these neighborhoods have been stretched by owner-occupant demand, people who are buying for lifestyle and school district access, not for yield. And those buyers are willing to accept returns that no rational investor would accept. If you are buying a single-family home in central Denver in 2026 as an investment, the data is telling you something you should listen to. Small multifamily, duplexes, triplexes, and 4-unit buildings in Denver's inner suburbs is where the calculus begins to shift. The suburbs in question are specific: Aurora's eastern corridors, Lakewood's older residential blocks, Commerce City, and select sections of Thornton and North Glen. These are not glamorous markets. They do not appear in lifestyle publications or relocation guides, but they share a set of characteristics that make them viable for investment in the current environment. Purchase prices that have not been inflated by owner-occupant lifestyle premiums, rental demand driven by working-class and lower-middle-income households whose housing options are constrained and whose propensity to churn is lower than the luxury rental market, and a supply pipeline that is almost entirely absent because new multifamily construction in these price tiers is economically non-viable at current construction costs. The cap rate picture in these suburban multifamily corridors is materially different from the urban single-family market. A well-maintained 4-unit building in Aurora's eastern zip codes, purchased in the $350,000 to $420,000 range, which is achievable in 2026, can produce gross annual rents of approximately $36,000 to $42,000 at current market rates. After vacancy allowance, property management, insurance, taxes, and maintenance reserves, the net operating income lands in the $20,000 to $23,000 range. That produces a cap rate of 5.5 to 6% on a market rate acquisition. Not exceptional by national standards, but viable for Denver, and viable in a way that almost nothing else in this market is. 5.5% is the floor where the investment math begins to work. Below that, you are speculating on appreciation to make up for the yield deficit. At 5.5% and above, the property generates real cash flow, and the appreciation becomes upside rather than dependency. The financing structure matters as much as the cap rate. An investor who brings 30% down on a $400,000 multifamily acquisition in Aurora, $120,000, at a 6.75% commercial rate is carrying a monthly debt service of approximately $2,060. Against a monthly gross rent collection of $3,000 to $3,500, the debt service coverage ratio lands between 1.45 and 1.7, well above the 1.25 minimum that most lenders require, and well above the threshold that makes a property resilient to vacancy spikes and unexpected capital expenditures. This is not a leveraged bet on appreciation. This is a cash-flowing asset in a market with structural rental demand and a finite supply of affordable workforce housing. There is one additional layer to the Denver multifamily investment thesis that deserves explicit attention: the regulatory environment. Colorado's legislature has been active on tenant protection legislation in recent years, and Denver's City Council has explored rent stabilization measures that have not yet passed but represent a genuine political risk for landlords over a 10-year hold period. This is not a reason to avoid the market. Rent stabilization risk exists in virtually every major metro in the country, but it is a reason to underwrite conservatively, to avoid buying at cap rates that leave no margin for a rent growth slowdown, and to favor properties in suburban jurisdictions that have historically been more landlord-friendly than the Denver city core. The investment case for Denver multifamily in 2026 is real. It is narrow, it is geographically specific, and it requires a level of market knowledge that most casual investors do not bring to the table. But for someone who does the work, understands the sub-market dynamics, and buys at the right price in the right zip codes, the math works. It just does not work everywhere. And knowing the difference between everywhere and the specific places where it does is the entire investment thesis. There is a version of this analysis that ends with a shrug, a list of variables and a conclusion that says it really depends on your situation. That version is useless, and this is not that version. The data we have built across this entire model points clearly toward specific profiles of people for whom Denver makes financial sense in 2026, and equally specific profiles for whom the numbers are telling a story they should listen to. Let's put names on those profiles, because abstract financial archetypes do not help anyone make a real decision. Meet Claire. She is 41 years old, a senior product manager at a Denver-based healthcare technology company, and she bought her home in the Stapleton neighborhood in 2019 for $380,000. Her mortgage rate is 3.25%. Her monthly carrying cost is approximately $1,850 for a 3-bedroom house that would rent today for $2,800 per month. Claire is sitting on roughly $180,000 in equity, a locked-in cost basis that is structurally below the current rental market, and a job that is embedded in Denver's healthcare tech corridor. The question for Claire is not whether to move to Denver. She is already there. The question is whether to stay. And for Claire, the answer is unambiguous. Her pre-2020 cost basis has insulated her from exactly the market dynamics that make Denver difficult for new arrivals. She is in the most financially favorable position available in this market, and leaving would mean voluntarily surrendering a structural advantage that cannot be replicated at today's entry prices. Now meet David. He is 33, a fully remote software engineer earning $145,000 annually, currently living in a 1-bedroom in San Francisco for $3,800 per month. He has been watching the Denver conversation for 2 years and is genuinely considering the move. His savings rate in San Francisco is approximately 9%, brutally low for his income level, entirely a function of the housing cost eating his financial life. In Denver, that savings rate climbs to approximately 22%, better than San Francisco by a meaningful margin, but 13 points below what Raleigh would produce with the same salary and the same discipline. David's dilemma is real. Denver is better than San Francisco, but it is not the best available option. For David, the honest recommendation is to make the move. Leaving San Francisco is the right call at any destination in this comparison set. But to treat Denver as a 2 to 3 year rental position, use the favorable tenant market window, save aggressively toward a down payment in a market with a shorter break-even timeline, and reassess whether Denver is the permanent destination or the bridge to the next decision. Denver can be the right move for David without being the final move. Then there is Elena. She is 38, a marketing director earning $118,000, with a partner who earns $72,000 in a hybrid role that requires being within commuting distance of a major metro. They have 2 kids, ages 8 and 11, and they are currently renting in Los Angeles for $4,200 a month. They have been considering Denver specifically because they have friends there, they have visited and loved it, and they feel a pull toward the mountain lifestyle that no spreadsheet fully captures. For Elena, the Denver analysis is the most complicated of the 3 profiles. The combined household income of $190,000 changes the math considerably. At that income level, Denver's savings rate suppression is proportionally less damaging, and the lifestyle premium begins to compete more seriously with the pure financial arbitrage available in Raleigh or Charlotte. But her partner's hybrid requirement constrains the comparison set, and Denver's job market for marketing leadership roles is thinner than Charlotte's, which adds career optionality risk to the equation. For Elena, Denver works but only if she enters as a renter for the first 2 to 3 years, avoids the temptation to buy immediately in a break-even environment that does not reward short-horizon purchases, and treats the school district selection with the same rigor she would apply to a financial investment, because in Denver, school district quality and home price are inseparably linked. The common thread across all three profiles is time horizon and cost basis. Claire works because her cost basis predates the market transformation. David works if he treats Denver as a financially disciplined rental play, rather than an immediate ownership commitment. Elena works at a higher income level, with a patient approach to entry. The profile of person for whom Denver does not work in 2026 is equally clear. Someone arriving with a single income below $100,000, planning to buy within the first 2 years at current prices and current rates, without a long-term commitment to staying 10 or more years. That person will spend more than they save, enter a home ownership position before the break-even clock justifies it, and likely exit the market in 5 to 7 years with transaction costs that erase whatever appreciation they captured. Denver has been that story for a lot of people over the last 4 years. The data has been telling that story consistently. The only question is whether the person reading this analysis is willing to hear it before they make the decision, rather than after. You watched this entire analysis because you wanted a verdict, not a framework, not a list of considerations, not a carefully hedged conclusion that sends you back to square one with slightly better vocabulary for your anxiety. A verdict. The data has been laid out across every dimension that matters: housing costs, tax burden, savings rate, break-even timeline, rental market dynamics, investment viability, and the human profiles that map to each outcome. The model is complete. Here is what it says. If you are already in Denver with a pre-2020 cost basis, a mortgage locked in below 4%, a rent that predates the migration surge, equity that has been compounding for 5 or more years, you do not leave. The structural advantage you hold in this market cannot be reconstructed at today's entry prices. Your monthly carrying cost is below current market rent for equivalent space, your equity position is real and growing, and the lifestyle premium you are paying for, the altitude, the access, the culture, you are paying it at a price that was set before the market fully understood what Denver would become. Stay. Protect that position. The numbers are working for you in a way they are not working for anyone arriving today. If you are coming from a high-cost coastal market, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, and Denver is on your list, the move directionally makes sense, but the destination requires precision. Enter as a renter. Use the current tenant market window, which is real and favorable and unlikely to last beyond 2027. Negotiate aggressively on your lease. 1 month free, waived fees, renewal option language, because the vacancy rate gives you leverage that you will not have again for several years. Set a specific savings target during your rental period. You need at least 20% down, plus closing costs, plus a 6-month reserve to buy in Denver without exposing yourself to unacceptable financial fragility. If reaching that number takes 3 years of disciplined saving at Denver's 19% savings rate, then 3 years is the timeline. Do not compress it because you fall in love with a neighborhood. If your income is below $100,000 and you are considering Denver as a primary destination rather than a stepping stone, the data points in one direction, and it is not Denver. Raleigh produces a 31% savings rate on $130,000. At lower incomes, the gap is even more pronounced because fixed housing costs consume a larger share of take-home pay. Charlotte delivers comparable career infrastructure for finance and operations professionals at a cost structure that accelerates wealth building by years, not months. Boise offers the outdoor-adjacent lifestyle that Denver sells as its primary identity, at a rental market that opens 12 to 18 months sooner, on the homeownership break-even clock. For someone at that income level building from the beginning, the math does not make Denver the right first chapter. It may be the right later chapter, when the wealth built elsewhere creates the financial cushion to absorb Denver's premium without sacrificing the savings rate that makes everything else possible. If you are an investor looking at Denver multifamily with capital to deploy, the thesis is narrow but executable. Suburban 4-unit buildings in Aurora, Lakewood, and the northeastern corridors at purchase prices below $420,000, generating cap rates of 5.5% or above, with a conservative financing structure and a 10-year hold horizon. That is the entire viable investment case in this market in 2026. Everything outside those parameters, single-family in desirable urban neighborhoods, new construction condos, short-term rental plays in a market that has tightened its regulatory posture, fails the basic return test at current prices and current rates. The investment case is not broad, but it is real, and it is available to the buyer who is willing to work in zip codes that do not photograph well for social media. Here is the complete verdict on Denver in 2026, stated without qualification. It is a good city for people who are already there and arrived early enough to hold an advantaged cost basis. It is a viable city for high earners, arriving from more expensive markets who enter as renters, maintain financial discipline, and treat homeownership as a 3-year decision rather than an immediate one. It is not the right primary destination for sub-6-figure earners who are trying to build wealth from a standing start. The savings rate math is too unfavorable compared to the alternatives, and the break-even timeline on buying is too long to justify the commitment at that income level. And it is a viable but narrow investment market for multifamily buyers who know exactly which submarkets produce viable yields and have the patience to wait for the right asset at the right price. Denver in 2026 is not a broken market. It is a premium market with specific conditions. The analysis has defined those conditions exactly. What you do with that information is the only decision left.